sure that when we say the Angelus, right, at 12 noon, so that we can get out there for an hour and a half for lunchtime. So we're going to pick up on the fourth commandment right now, honor thy father and thy mother. So firstly, the sins of children towards their parents. Disobedience and disrespect will almost always be venial sins. However, there are three cases when mortal sin can take place. Firstly, grave disobedience. The typical example of this is a teenager who sneaks out of the house to go on a date without the permission of the parents. And the reason that this is grave matter is because the parents have the right and the obligation to know when and with whom their children are. Second case is grave dishonor. Typical case here is where a teenager or young adult slaps a parent in the face. A third case is grave grief given to the parents through the immoral behavior of the children, usually by shagging and stuff like that, obviously. Then let's look at the sins of parents concerning their children. If you give bad example by staying away from the sacraments for a long time, if you neglect the baptism or confirmation or Catholic education of a child, even if you neglect to explain the facts of life to the children, and of course that's going to be done incrementally as a child ages. This will all be mortal sins, actually. Yeah. And oftentimes it's that last one about explaining the facts of life. Oftentimes even the best parents tend to be negligent about this. That's why I do mention this. It's very important. The old saying is that better a year too early than a day too late. And that's very true. What about failing to correct the faults of the children? Now we're only talking about minors under the age of 18 here. So if a child is committing mortal sin, obviously the parents have an obligation to say something about it, obviously. Otherwise, we're talking about venial sins, which is more typical for children. And here you want to avoid two extremes. You want to avoid just criticizing them for every little thing that only discourages them. And then you want to avoid them getting away with murder also, which is more typical, especially of our California culture. So moderation is the main word here, actually. What is certain is that you as parents must correct the habitual faults of a minor child. So if your minor child is, you find them having habits of lying, of cheating, petty theft, bad language, yeah, there's an obligation to correct that. There's another principle involved here with the fourth commandment, that parents are responsible for the sins of your children. We're talking about minor children, if you could have prevented those sins. So the main two areas where parents can be negligent is with regards to the occasions of sin. So there's two areas. So one is with regards to the media, the other is dating rules. So let's take a look at this. With regards to media, modern technology. And I'm not saying that modern technology is all bad, no it's not, but it's easily abused. That's why it's important especially for internet, parents, you've got to have blockers on. If you've got kids in the house, you've got to have blockers on. So it's just like, you're thinking of this. Sorry. Yeah. Don't get me going on this subject. You stupid people. You stupid people. People who just don't think about these things. Don't get me going. Okay. So that's why, parents, if you give your child a smartphone, you are responsible. Anything that they look at, if they commit mortal sin, it's your sin. Okay? I want to make that very clear. You will burn in hell for every time your child looks at anything that they should not be looking at. Okay? Realize this. Yeah, that's why blockers are essential. Don't fool yourselves. Many parents, even the best parents, think, my child would never look at anything like that. Oh yeah? Figure that. Okay. And then secondly, with regards to dating rules. So dating is not simply an opportunity for a smooch test. No, dating is meant as a preparation for the sacrament of matrimony. That's why, yeah, you've got to prepare wholly for marriage. So a young man may not begin dating until he is financially able to support a wife and family. So if he's entering a profession, let's say he's going through college, he's got a good job lined up for himself right out of college, maybe he's 21 years old, one more year to go, yeah, at that point, he could possibly start dating. A young man who's going into a trade right after high school, if he's making enough money to support a wife and family, yes, he can start dating at that point, not before. Teenage dating? No, it's simply the occasion of sin, honestly. Parents who think that this is cute, yeah, don't get me wrong. Okay. Now, young ladies simply must be emotionally capable of motherhood. And I think most of our girls, by the time they're 18, they do have that emotional maturity. Not that I would suggest that they run after the first Joe Six-Pack who comes across their path, okay? That's important. So, if these criteria are not met, it would be a mortal sin for a teenager to start dating, simply because of the occasion of sin involved. So teenagers in general, I say in general, not in particular, teenagers are forbidden to date. Now, obviously, they're social beings. They need to be around people their own age. This is to be encouraged, especially with other people of their own sex, actually, and ideally among traditional Catholics. There's these people who have good moral values. Certainly, at any rate, there must be no pairing off until they're actually ready to think about marriage. Otherwise, don't get me going. I can tell you so many stories. Okay, now, gambling. I'd like to mention about gambling. Gambling in itself is not sinful, but if you do recklessly endanger family finances, that would be sinful. Now, going on to the fifth commandment, thou shalt not kill. The principle here is that God is the author of life, and therefore only he has sovereign rights over its use. So that's why birth control, abortion, sterilization, in vitro fertilization, and euthanasia, or cooperation in any of these things will absolutely be mortal. So with regards to abortion, there is also an excommunication attached, not only to the one who has the abortion herself, but to anyone who cooperates in procuring the abortion. With regards to sterilization, because this is also sin of injustice towards one's spouse, there is actually a grave obligation to have the sterilization reversed if it's still possible. Sometimes there are circumstances that prevent the reversal. If you're ever in question, just talk to a priest about it. Deliberately to cause a miscarriage would be a mortal sin. With regards to the means of preserving life, and I mention this because nowadays euthanasia is becoming more common here in the United States. So we make a distinction between the ordinary means of preserving life and the extraordinary means. And I'm going to really oversimplify these here just to make them sort of understandable. So the ordinary means there are three things that must always be given a dying person in whatever way is conveniently possible to give them. Water, air, and nutrition. These three things must be given a dying person in whatever way can conveniently be given. So there's a lot of gray area there, okay? And then the extraordinary means of preserving life are extraordinary because they're either so painful or so expensive. These are never obligatory, but simply optional. Now, as I say, the principles are black and white. However, the application of the principles, there's a lot of gray area there. That's why if you are taking care of a loved one in their last months, it's good to speak to a priest just to make sure that you are abiding by God's laws and pleasing God, which is ultimately what matters. Then we go on to another principle with the fifth commandment with regards to drink and drug abuse. So the principle is this, that God has given to mankind the use of reason. That means that we know the difference between right and wrong. And therefore we do not have the right to deprive ourselves of the use of reason without a very grave motive. Let's give an example where it's okay. You're going into a hospital to have an operation. Of course you take the anesthesia to knock you out, okay? That's okay. But, so, that's where it's okay. But no matter what your spouse is like, no matter what your kids are like, no matter what your boss is like, you're not allowed to get tipsy or drunk. So let's take a look at this. So the relaxed feeling that comes from alcohol in moderation, and that's the key word here, moderation, that's okay because you're still in complete control of your senses. The idea behind this is that by relaxing our mind and body, that be able to serve God better, that we'll actually be able to carry our cross with greater patience and perseverance. That's the idea behind alcohol, okay? If it's focused on God, that's okay. We serve God better. It's when we start drinking it, because this it makes me feel good to have a buzz. That's selfish, okay? That's no longer towards God, love of God. That's love of self, love of my stomach. No, that's what's wrong. That's what we want to avoid. So tipsiness is when you still know the difference between right and wrong, but it's getting fuzzy. That's a venial sin. So that's when you've got to avoid tipsiness. And then actual drunkenness, fall down drunk, person doesn't even remember what happened. That's a mortal sin because they lost the use of that reason. Now also then with regards to drug usage, drug abuse, so if that kind of the drugs that warp your mind, yeah, of course this is going to be offensive to God, because you're certainly not doing it to please God. That's for sure. Then, with regards to confessing sins of drunkenness and drug abuse, you also need to confess anyone who is scandalized. In other words, did anyone see you in that state? And then also with regards to drug abuse, did you share the drug with anyone else? And you have to say how many people you shared it with, because then you cause them to offend God too. Now, with regards to tobacco products, like smoking cigarettes and like that, I know the joke is, there's a joke back 40 years ago in the 1980s, there's only two sins left in the modern church. One is smoking and the other is being a traditional Catholic. Yeah, it's true, actually. So actually speaking, tobacco products, it's not sinful to use those, unless you have a family history of lung disease. Then yeah, it would just be stupid to do that. It could be considered an improvement in fact. Gluttony will almost always be a venial sin, only in the case where there's, especially if it's frequent vomiting, then it could become mortal because of the damage that's done to the esophagus, actually, through doing that frequently. With regards to the occasions of sin, an occasion of sin is a person, place, or thing that normally leads you to offend God mortally. So that's why we have a grave obligation to avoid these proximate occasions of mortal sin. Now, obviously, the occasions of sin will differ from person to person, largely on account of one's sex, one's age, etc. So that's why everyone needs to know what's the occasion of sin. Now, some very common occasions of sin are going to be TV. Of course, you use TV nowadays. It's all got it on your phone, right? That's why the internet is the main occasion of sin nowadays, actually. So, watch out for those phones and laptops and computers and everything else. But it's that, what you've got in your pocket, that's an occasion that can't easily be an occasion of sin right there. For young people, bad companions, especially like in college, if they're leading you to do dumb things that are offensive to God, you have to watch out for who your friends are. And then also for some people who are alcoholics, walking into a bar, that's going to be an occasion of sin for them. So each one of us has to know what the occasions of sin are for us, and therefore avoid them, so that we don't offend God. Anger will normally be a venial sin. It's to be mortal only when you actually have a real punch up in like that. Hatred normally is going to be venially sinful, because it's simply, when we say I hate so-and-so, we usually mean I really dislike his guts. That's going to be venially sinful. Now, hatred in the theological sense means wanting someone to burn in hell forever. And if you really do mean that, yeah, it would be a mortal sin. But as I say, usually when we say I hate someone, we don't mean it in the theological sense. Abuse, whether physical, emotional, sexual, whatever, will always be sinful. Attempted suicide, by its nature, is mortal. Oftentimes there can be a lack of sufficient reflection of full consent of the will, which would make the sin subjectively venial. Mutilation, so we're talking about tattoos and piercings here. Normally this is going to be a venial sin, simply because our bodies are temples of the Holy Ghost, and we don't want to be treating them in a way that's not appropriate, that God doesn't want. We have to ask ourselves, why do I get this tattoo? Is it because I love God so much? Or is it just because I want it for myself, which is going to be the case usually. So if a tattoo is blasphemous or immodest, then it would be a mortal sin. And of course, so pierced ears for ladies, that's allowed by custom. Pierced ears for men are not. And then nowadays, especially in California, you get nose rings, you get tongue studs, you get belly button rings. These things are just That brings us to our 6th and 9th commandments. Thou shalt not commit adultery, and thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife. So here I'll try to be very discreet, but the principle is important to understand, that God has given to mankind the reproductive power, not primarily for our personal satisfaction, but primarily for the continuation of the human race. And that's why any sins against the 6th and 9th commandments will be grave matter by its very nature, because of the grave disorder from God's plan. That's also why parents must educate your children. Again, it's going to be incrementally as the children age, precisely so that the children can avoid offending God by sin and please God by practicing the Christian virtues. Then, let's look at some of the states of life. Those who are civilly divorced are forbidden to date because they're still married in God's eyes. Those who are allowed to date must avoid the unnecessary occasions of sin. For example, dating couples must avoid being alone in private for a long time. Danger zone. Also, they have to avoid prolonged signs of affection. Easy mortal sin. Please remember, passionate kissing outside of marriage. Oh yeah, that's a mortal sin, definitely. Shacking up, mortal sin. That should be obvious, okay? Now, for married couples, the marriage debt is a grave obligation in justice, and to deny the marriage debt would ordinarily be a mortal sin. Now, I will make a distinction between an actual denial of the debt, which would be normally mortal, and a mere deferral. You put it off by a day or whatever, and you both agree to it, and neither of you is put into an occasion of sin as a result. Normally, that can be allowed. But an actual denial of marriage debt, yeah, it's a grave sin against justice towards your spouse, actually. It's true that there are certain exceptions to that also, so if you ever have questions, you can always ask a priest. With regards to what's called NFP work rhythm, it's prudent to speak to a confessor first. Please remember that temptations are not sins, so you can always confess temptations in confession, but tell the priest that you tried to fight them off. Otherwise, you think that you consented to them. Desires are different from mere thoughts. And with regards to the object of thoughts and desires, the priest will always presume a person of the opposite sex. If not, it must be specified in the confession, because this is part of the species of the sin, actually. With regards to looks, a first look will oftentimes be involuntary. You're walking down the street, you happen to notice it. Okay, as long as you don't take the second glance, as long as you get gawk and stare, that's just a temptation. Whereas the second glance, yeah, that's one. Now, with regards to words, for example, jokes or boasting, you also need to confess how many persons were scandalized and how many, were there any children present, which makes it a worse sin scandal. With regards to impure acts, and please remember that incomplete actions are also mortal sins. It must be specified whether it was alone or with another. If it was with another, the priest will always presume the person of the opposite sex. If not, it must be specified, because that is part of the species of the sin. It must be specified whether it was alone or with someone who was married, and then you have to specify. So the difference here is the sin of fornication to unmarried persons, single adultery, one married, the other unmarried, double adultery, both married but to different partners. Also, if it was with someone that you were related to, because that's part of the species of the sin. Also, anything that was unnatural, because that is part of the species of the sin also. However, obviously, please do not confess unnecessary details. With regards to modesty, so one, we're not allowed to lead others into temptation by the way we dress, and that goes for both men and ladies. And then secondly, for ladies who simply want to guard your femininity, and that way you want to dress Mary-like and ladylike. And so with regards to the sin of immodesty, anything that is very tight, and this goes for both men and women, anything that is very tight or provocative, yeah, that would be sinful, of course. And parents, remember that you are responsible for the way that your children, your teenagers dress. Then, dancing. Dancing expresses joy. This is what St. Alphonsus says. It does not express lust. So that's why certain kinds of dancing should normally be okay. Folk dancing, square dancing, normally okay. Anything that is inappropriate, gyrations, that's meant to be provocative, yeah, that would be sinful. And then also, I'll simply mention romance novels for ladies. Be very careful because there's a lot of really cruddy stuff out there, and your children will notice what kind of books you've got in your house. So be very careful about that, ladies, please. So the priest will always try to avoid asking questions about the 6th and 9th commandments. He does not have to. He'll only ask questions if it really is necessary for the validity of the sacrament, and also to help you through a temptation. However, on your part, as the peasant, if you are ever in doubt whether something is sinful or not for your state of life, so feel free to ask the priest, both in the confessional or even outside the confession, because the priest knows God's law, and he can discreetly explain to you what you need to know in order to save your soul. Good. That's a shortened version of these commandments. And if you would now kneel down for our